The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. What are the forces that have shaped American cities, and how can they have produced places as different in character as, say, New York and Phoenix? In his new book, City Life, Urban Expectations in the New World, architect and social historian Witold Rybczynski details how cities have evolved and explores how their unique identities reflect distinctly American concerns. Rybczynski's previous books include Home and The Most Beautiful House in the World. He is a professor of urbanism at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Welcome.
Thank you.
You talk about a lot of different forces that shaped cities, large and small. One of the most intriguing that I found was what you called the clash between horizontal ideals and vertical aspirations. What did you mean by that?
Well, American cities have always had these two goals. One was to spread out and to take advantage of, initially it was for fire. It was just to get buildings far apart. And somehow there was a sense that in a country that was this empty, this open, you could really take advantage of that. So all these people who, after all, were Europeans and Englishmen and came over here and didn't build European type of cities. They built a very different sort of city, which was horizontal. At one point, the ideals became vertical because, after all, we also invented skyscrapers, which is the exact opposite. And so you have these vertical downtowns and yet these horizontal cities all around them. And there has been this pull between we want to be denser, but we want to spread out, and it sort of goes back and forth.
Does part of that come from, I'd use the word ambivalence, but some of the quotes from Thomas Jefferson, for example, seem to indicate outright hostility to the whole concept of cities?
Jefferson really didn't like cities, or at least he spent a lot of time in Paris, so I don't think he had anything against certain cities.
He didn't like American cities.
But he didn't think we should have big cities like the Europeans. He thought they were dangerous, that they could be undemocratic, that people wouldn't, you would have, the mob would sort of rule, would take over rather than individuals making individual decisions. And of course he lived in a mountaintop, and although he lived a very urbane life, as I point out, I mean, he had all the comforts that you would wish. Of course, he was wrong on that, at least, because Americans did build cities, and very quickly, and were attracted to them. And his notion really never caught on. It was very much a minority view.
Oh, he referred to them as a pestilence, that cities could be something like stores. He was really fairly critical of them. We also have, in looking at a contrast between Europe and the United States, a way of, at least the early cities, differentiating what their roles were. And you have Washington, D.C., which in the layout of it, in the look of it, symbolizes the government of the country. Then you see a place like New York or later Chicago, money centers, commerce centers. Was that deliberately done or something that just happened?
The politics was deliberate, making capital cities that were not the main city. And I think part of it was the idea of putting the capital in the geographic center of each state, which tended not to be where the main city was, because usually it was on a river or on the ocean or where there was a harbor. So you get, Harrisburg in Pennsylvania is in the middle of the state, and Philadelphia is in one corner because that's where the river is.
Albany in New York, Olympia in Seattle.
In fact, the only difference, the only cases that are different are some of the New England states, like Boston, which is also the capital, or Providence, Rhode Island, or but generally that's been the case. But I think it was also a sense that not to put too much in one place. There was a skepticism about putting business and politics, I think, close together. And so we've never had a city like Paris, which has art and business and politics and all kind of taking place in one city, or London or Berlin. Our cities have always had different roles. In Washington and New York and Boston, for instance, in the early days, were the political, business, and cultural capital, and they were quite separate.
And it sort of does go back to Jefferson, this distrust of what would happen to the politics and the democratic ideals of the country if you put them right next to the business and everything else that was going on.
It's also the case, though, that this is such a huge country that I don't think you can imagine one city dominating it. Not in a democracy. Russia's a big country, and of course it is dominated by one city, but it was not a democracy. You had millions and millions of peasants, and then this one city where the Tsar kind of ruled the place. But in a democracy, you can't imagine one city which will dominate from sea to sea. It's just too big a place.
You're fairly critical of what's happened with cities in the last 50 years. What has happened since the World War II years, and why has so much of it gone awry?
Well, we had this period between the Depression and the Second World War where we basically stopped building. There was no money, then there were the wars, so there was all the money went into the war effort. And when we restarted building and building cities in 1949, we also basically forgot our whole urban history and kind of started over, chiefly influenced by European modernism. And so we built tall buildings, we built housing projects. We really didn't, we lost the evolutionary sort of strain that had really evolved. And people talk about America, that our cities aren't planned, which is absolutely untrue. There was an enormous amount of planning that went on. But we kind of lost contact with it, and we reinvented our cities in a very different way.
I was struck by an enormous contrast in what was built in those post-war years. And it was the contrast between the push out into the suburbs that was probably typified by the legendary Levittown suburban development, and public housing, which, contrary to the idea that people seem to like to have a little house and a little yard, took people and stuck them all close together and stacked them on top of each other. Why was there that great difference, or do you see it as being that different?
No, I think you make a good point. It is a difference. It's probably mainly the difference between the private market and the public authorities, and they're having at that moment two very different views of how people should live. And Americans, ordinary Americans, would never have lived in tall apartment buildings, except in special cases like Midtown Manhattan. And yet the government took the poorest people and put them in this really odd, unusual type of housing, which in the long run had terrific problems. We're tearing down most of those buildings now, which is an awful waste if you think about it. It's not that long ago.
But you make a point of what a basic American ideal it is, of our great attachment to this idea of the freestanding house and a little patch of earth, however small it may be.
It goes right to the beginning, and of course it does create big problems. It's why our cities are horizontal rather than compact the way continental European cities are. But I think it's a very basic part of our culture, the domestic ideal, the family and the house, and one of the things I think that happened with the kind of post-Roosevelt plans was that they really set aside this ideal and had a very different notion of European type of cities, which they tried to introduce, at least for the poor, and it simply didn't work.
Another development in the last 50 years has been the growth and expansion of cities in the western part of the country. Because of the time in which they took place, and maybe because of the geography in which they took place, how different are they and why?
They're totally different, and I guess the why is probably, one of the simplest explanations is the automobile. Not only cars, not only personal cars, but trucks. And when you talk about the automobile city, you imagine commuters, but really it's the trucks that are just as important, because services and goods and everything in this country now flows on four wheels. And that's what makes the Western cities. That's why they're so horizontal, because the scale of those cities is the scale of somebody driving at 40 miles an hour rather than the scale of a railroad or a streetcar, which is what formed Chicago or Philadelphia or New York. That's a radical change. And I guess one of the discoveries in thinking and writing the book was the idea that this is a new kind of city. It's not a bad city, or it's not an anti-city. It's just another type. And it's a type where people move at a different speed, and so the city follows that form, and you get strip malls rather than concentrated things. You don't have department stores in those cities. You don't have the huge railroad terminals. You have airports, but they're outside the city.
They're much more decentralized.
Yes, so the whole city starts to become very difficult to grasp. It's hard to draw, if you're a planner or an architect, one of those cities, because they just have these kind of amoeba-like forms, although I make the parallel in the book with medieval towns, because medieval towns, if you think of Venice, it's a bit like Houston, except they have canals instead of freeways, and the scale is all different, but it has this funny kind of organic-y...
I'm still working on that comparison.
Organic-y shape. Venice is not a grid. It's not... It's laid out because it grew very slowly, and the different scales of movement kind of extended, but in a very meandering way. The way you build freeways, you don't lay out freeways on straight lines. They all sort of snake around.
You mentioned that there has been planning, and that cities look the way they do because planning has taken place. You also have lovely points of serendipity in this book. For example, explain why, I didn't know this until I read the book, why Piggly Wiggly had such an effect on how cities grew.
Well, Piggly Wiggly was the first supermarket, and it was, I think it was in the South somewhere. I can't remember the city.
Is that Memphis?
Memphis, you're right. Where it had an effect was that it was simply somebody's idea of trying to bring a kind of assembly line into a grocery store. But when you take the supermarket, the refrigerator, which develops about that time, and the car, you have this system where you can take a lot of groceries, put them in your car because you couldn't carry that much, and store them for a week. And so it changes the way we shop. Instead of shopping every day, we now can shop once a week, which means that you don't need a corner store, and your whole pattern alters. And the idea of the old city where you could walk every day, and as people still do, say, in the center of Paris, or used to, it's really disappearing. But before the French really went into, say, refrigeration in a big way, people had tiny little ice boxes and bought every day. So the whole lifestyle changes because of these three inventions. And if you take out one of the inventions, it doesn't work, which is what's so weird about it. It is serendipity because you almost feel it's like an accident, but has terrific consequences.
Here you build this big store where it's outside of the city because it is so big. Piggly Wiggly was a huge place, and it acts as a magnet to draw people out of the city, and then just sort of happens from there.
The other thing, of course, is somebody invents the grocery cart, which is another terrific invention because you can't shop in a big store like that without some sort of cart. But then the cart only goes on one floor, so those stores become very big, and they can't. I've never seen a two-story grocery supermarket. So you end up very big, and the first ones were actually in cities, but very quickly they went to the outskirts of cities because the land was too expensive in a city to build horizontal stores.
So that's a horizontal kind of force, and then the vertical force was, we have the man named Otis to thank for that, whose name we see in every elevator.
Absolutely. Actually, two things, I think. There was Otis, which is the obvious one because you can go up high, and the steel construction, which allowed you to go up high from the architectural point of view. But also the telephone comes along at exactly that time. I don't think you could conduct business in very tall buildings that way without telephones because you couldn't communicate properly. And so the fact that you had telephones meant you could be on the 20th floor of this building and somebody else could be on the 20th floor of their building, or you could talk to each other. And you didn't have to have messengers running. Otherwise, I think there would have been a reason not to go high. It would have been too awkward.
What are the trends that are developing now that are changing the way that we build places? One of them that you talk about is something called old-fangled development.
Well, that's some architects and planners are looking back to some of the earlier suburbs, and I devote a chapter to that. What's striking about the suburbs of the 1920s, which were planned, I refer them as garden suburbs because they're very green, but they were very, very planned, is that they've all succeeded virtually. They're all still there. And in fact, they're all where the richest people live. Beverly Hills is one of those planned suburbs. Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia or Coral Gables. They're all success stories because they were so well planned. They weren't necessarily planned for rich people. They're such nice places that they've attracted.
Aesthetically, they're very beautiful places.
And sort of they're nice to walk around. The way they're planned is very nice. They have character. They have the people doing it knew what they were doing, and there is a sort of rediscovery of those things, in an attempt to say, well, if they could do it, we could do it too, and kind of turn the clock back in a sense. And also they're nice because they're not actually, they're horizontal, but they're not as horizontal. They found a way to balance privacy, which we want, but also a sense of community. Not only privacy.
It's a very tricky balance to find.
Well,
so how is old-fangled taking the lessons of the garden suburbs with the necessity of the modern suburb and putting them together?
Well, it's saying, do you really need 1 acre? I mean, if you can still have outdoor space, and you need an acre if you want total privacy, but if you want a sense of community, we find that you need actually much smaller lots so that you can bump into your neighbor and see him when you're taking the garbage out, whereas if you're on an acre lot, he's so far away, maybe you could wave, but the distances are too. So that there are these funny limits. Although we can drive in cars, if we're walking, we need closeness to speak to people or to be aware of people. And that really hasn't changed, and there's an attempt to sort of bring back some of those smaller distances. People like walking a lot for recreation today. And the communities planned for privacy are not terribly interesting to walk in. So the houses are hidden.
It's to get us out of that time between the car and the house and have us more of a neighborhood kind of feel, a community feel.
Exactly. I think there's a desire, a growing desire, I think, on the public for a sense of community, not only a sense of privacy.
What kind of impact is technology having on urban planning? I mean, the fact that now you can sit in front of a computer and look at a three-dimensional model of something and play around with the shape of it. Is it going to give us better cities or worse cities?
Well, I recently wrote a piece about this for the New York Times Magazine, and I argued that one of the effects is that it makes small cities much more attractive, because with this decentralization with cable TV and Federal Express and VCRs, you don't have to give up so much to live in a small city. The sort of quality of life doesn't change that much compared to a very large city. And so I think one of the things it does is that it gives small cities a kind of edge which they previously didn't have. In the past, a small city was a hick town, basically. It didn't have, you couldn't see the sports, for instance. Now you can watch baseball anywhere.
Have a dish anywhere.
So or you couldn't see art movies, except in a really big city, or maybe in a college town which had art cinemas. Now you can rent videos and you can watch them at home. So I think that it encourages the growth of smaller cities, and I think there is some evidence that that's taking place.
I had read a piece recently that talked about that the language of computer technology is full of architectural terms. It's, you got chat rooms and sites and all this sort of stuff. And whoever wrote it was concerned that we might get confused between that which is essentially intellectual architecture and real architecture. And it echoed a quote that you had in your book from Robert Hughes, the architectural critic and writer who was writing about Brasilia, the built-up capital of Brazil. And he said, there is a difference between places that are designed out of abstract space and places that are real places. And what clicked for me was, gee, if we're all involved in using this technology to envision the future, will it give us a future that has the intimacy that we seem to want so much?
It'll probably replace some of it. I mean, some of the things which are now physical will be non-physical. On the other hand, if you look at, say, the attraction of waterfront development today, and so many cities are developing their waterfronts, and people like it, and it's hard to figure out what it is that attracts us. It's something about the water and the expanse and the seagulls, and those things are not the same if you just see a picture on a screen of some water. And I think, or the fact that old neighborhoods are attractive to people. We like the sense of history that they have. We like to walk around and look at the old buildings. We may not live in that kind of neighborhood, but they've acquired a sort of attraction, which also suggests that just because you can have a CD-ROM with cities of the world on it, that doesn't mean you're not going to want to see those places or places like that in your own town. So I would think that there will be change inevitably, and it will replace some of the things. On the other hand, Hughes is right. I mean, a real sense of age cannot be created. And the moment you find out it's not real, it loses something. So Disneyland is attractive, but really old places where Benjamin Franklin really walked is also attractive.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what Disney Imagineering does with Times Square, since they've just gotten the contract to rebuild that part of New York City. Do we really know what we want in cities? For example, if you read Money Magazine's annual survey of the places people want to live and the qualities that they want in places, I mean, from one year to the next, we want to live in rural South Dakota, and then we want to live in San Francisco.
Yeah, we're fickle, and our cities are the result of many individual decisions, and that's their character. That also sets them apart. They're not the result of a king saying this is the way it's going to be, or an archbishop, or even a French president. I talk about Paris and how Mitterrand just decides things. I mean, we're going to have an opera house here, then they have a competition, and he personally picks the winner. I mean, that's not going to happen in our political system. And so our cities always surprise us because it's a lot of individual decisions which are sort of hidden, and then we suddenly see the result and we say, wait a minute, they've all just moved over there. Why are they all in the Sun Belt? Or why there's a city here that wasn't here before? So that is a characteristic, and I think will continue to be. They're not things that you can neatly sort of line up and say, this is the way it's going to be, and everybody, behind me.
Otherwise, South Dakota would be filled to the rafters. One of the things you say about cities of the future is that whatever shape they take, they will depend on the goodwill of their citizens for their well-being. In light of that, one of the trends we haven't talked about yet is sort of the opposite of the old-fangled development, and that is the growth of what are called enclaves, and almost the medieval European walled cities. I mean, are these here to stay? Are they a portent of the future, or just more American fickleness?
I think they are here to stay. There's already a very large number, and there are very few planned communities which they're not necessarily all walled, but they do have shared facilities, whether it's garbage collection or tennis courts or recreational facilities or daycare centers. They're like cities in that way. What they represent is this desire for community and a loss of confidence that the actual community will provide that. What's interesting about those places is that people pay, in effect, taxes. They call them, fees or something, but they're really taxes. And everybody knows that Americans will refuse to pay taxes for anything. Well, clearly that's not true. These people are paying taxes. It's because they have confidence that their tax money is going to be used to maintain the park. And unfortunately, in many of our communities, we've lost confidence in the public authorities. And the reason we don't want to pay taxes is because we see the rundown parks and we see the cracked sidewalks, and we don't believe them anymore. So that's what I think these new communities demonstrate. It's not actually anti-community, it's wanting to create a community, but having lost confidence that the public process is going to do that. So they're troubling and not troubling at the same time.
It is, though, in the view of some critics, it's a redefinition of the public square and,
yes.
and the idea of the city as a collection point for a great number of different people. It's now a segregating off, in a sense. It goes back to the very heart of the democratic ideal and the
well,
aspirations.
it's also a reaction to a society which has said, if in the street you can do anything, any barbaric behavior is tolerated in public spaces. You can urinate on the street, we're not going to arrest you. You can act any way you want. You can make as much noise as you want. That was not, in fact, the way you behaved in our cities 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. There were much more strict standards about it. So you can also say that this is a reaction to a sort of deteriorating public space and the desire to create spaces that are more human and less barbaric.
And so the enclaves are one reaction, but if history and your book mean anything, for every action there will be a reaction, and certainly it will shape the cities of the future. Witold Rybczynski, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Upon Reflection, City Life, your new book.
Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.